Hello there, this is Marisa Peña, and today we will be studying function transformations, specifically transformations on the equation y equals x and y equals x squared. Now let's look at first y equals x. This is the linear parent function, and y equals x is the equation for the linear parent function. Now we will be studying this equation in the form of y equals mx plus b, where m is the slope of our function and b is the y-intercept. Now we'll study the effects of changing m and changing b. Again, m is our slope and b is our y-intercept. Now, as we can see right now, our slider, the value for our slope, our m, is set to 1. And we can verify if we rise and run from any two consecutive points that the slope, we rise 1 and we run 1, would be a slope of 1. Now what happens as we change our slope? We're going to make it a larger number in the positive direction and see how this affects our graph. So if I grab my slider and let's study the effects of changing the slope to a larger number. How is this affecting our line? Well, as my number is getting larger, I notice that my graph, the graph of my line, is getting closer to the y-axis. And in all cases, when our number gets larger, as we see here in the 10, our graph is going to be getting closer and closer to the y-axis. This means that our line is steeper. And the steeper our line is, in other words, the larger our value for m is, the steeper our line becomes. Now, the smaller our m becomes, the less steep our graph is. Now, what would happen at 0? Well, at 0, if we think about it, if our slope was 0 and we multiplied the m, which is 0, times x, we would end up with 0. In other words, a constant. And this is our constant y equals 0, so we get a horizontal line, which is expected. Now, what happens when we change our m in the negative direction? If we take our m, let's drag it and move it in the negative side, okay? Two things are starting to happen. First of all, our line has changed directions. Our graph changes direction. This is due to only the negative sign. Okay, this negative right here causes our graph to change direction. Now, the absolute value of m, which would be 1.4 in this case, is the steepness of our graph, or the slope, and it affects steepness. So if I move in the negative direction, as the absolute value of m is getting larger, our graph is also becoming steeper, just like it did in the positive direction. So as we can see, changing the value of m affects the steepness, the tilt of our line. And the larger our number gets, whether it's in the positive direction or in the negative direction, our line is becoming steeper the larger the number gets. The smaller it gets, the less steep it becomes until it is 0, approaches the constant, and changes directions. Now, we've checked the effects of changing m in our equation. What about changing our b? Our b here is our y-intercept. In other words, where our line is crossing the y-axis. And if we look over here on our graph, we can see that our graph is crossing the y-axis at the 0. And that is because the value of b equals 0. Now, what happens if we change our b in the positive direction? Let's grab our slider, and we can see that as I change the b in the positive direction, my graph is being vertically translated or shifted upward. Okay, here our b is set at 7, and as we can tell, it is crossing our graph at the positive 7 on the y-axis. If I change my b to the negative side, it doesn't change direction like it did with the slope, but instead it is translated down however many units we are moving to. For example, here our b is -7, and we can tell that it is crossing the y, which is our y-intercept, at the -7. So the effects of changing b only affect our vertical shift or translation. In other words, it moves our graph up or down, depending on what b is, while m changes the steepness of our graph. Okay, we have looked at the effects of changing the m and the b in the linear function. Let's look now at our quadratic function, y equals x squared. This is our parent quadratic. And we're going to study quadratics in the form of y equals ax squared plus c, where a is the number in front of that x squared and c is just a constant that is added. So if we look at this right now, our slider is set at 1. Okay, what would happen if I change my slider to a larger a value? Well, as I am changing the a value, if we look at the graph, our parabola, in other words, this right here, our U-shaped graph, which is called the parabola, is becoming narrower. And the larger a gets, the narrower my parabola becomes. The smaller a gets, the wider it becomes. So changing a obviously affects the width of our parabola, of our graph. Now what happens when we go into the negative direction? Well, just like in our linear function, our graph changed directions from negative or from positive to negative, the same thing is going to happen here. In this case, when our parabola is positive, the value of a is positive, our parabola is opening upward. If we change it to a negative, this will cause our parabola to open downward, as we can see. Again, we always take the absolute value of a. So in this case, the negative, just like it did with the linear function, only affects the direction of our graph. Either it is going to open up when it is positive or down when it is negative. The absolute value of a, once more, affects only the width. And as we can see, our a is getting larger, not considering the negative because we're taking the absolute value of it. So our graph is becoming narrower. So now we see that changing the a in the quadratic function affects the width of our graph. And once again, if a equals 0, we should expect a constant. And in this case, the constant is going to be whatever c is. In this case, our c equals 0. Okay, let's change our width of our parabola to a 1. And let's study now the effects of changing c. Okay, if I move my c in the positive direction, I can see that my graph is being shifted upward. So again, just like the linear function, changing the value of c affects vertical translation. As I go down to the negative side, our graph is being shifted downward in the negative direction. We can see that the vertex, in other words, this point of our parabola, is either going to be shifted up or down, depending on what c is. So if I go in the positive direction, it's being shifted upward. In the negative direction, it is being shifted downward. Now we have seen the changes in a and c of quadratic functions. Again, a affects our width. We can make our parabola wide, narrow. Negative affects direction. And our c, once more, affects vertical translation. Thank you.